She left the castle expecting to learn about her people, but what she found in the heart of the town changed her life forever. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets of Ashford like a thick woolen blanket, wrapping the medieval English town in an ethereal shroud that seemed to muffle even the earliest stirrings of daily life. Princess Rosalind stood before the tall, gilded mirror in her private chambers within Thornhaven Castle, her reflection revealing a young woman of extraordinary beauty, whose deep emerald eyes held both intelligence and a restless longing that no amount of luxury could satisfy. Her hair, the color of burnished copper, cascaded down her back in waves that caught the pale light filtering through the narrow stone windows, and her porcelain skin bore the unmistakable glow of youth and privilege. She was 22 years old, an age when most noble daughters had already been married off to secure alliances, yet she remained unwed, much to her father's growing frustration. The princess reached up to remove the delicate silver circlet that rested upon her brow, setting it carefully on the dark wooden table beside her. The weight of it, though slight in physical terms, had always felt crushing to her spirit. Born into royalty, she had spent her entire life within the confines of castle walls, surrounded by servants who bowed and scraped, courtiers who flattered and schemed, and advisors who spoke in carefully measured tones designed to tell her only what they believed she should hear. The tapestries that adorned her walls depicted grand battles and noble hunts. But Rosalind had never experienced anything beyond the manicured gardens and cold stone corridors of her gilded prison. She wondered constantly what lay beyond those walls, what thoughts occupied the minds of common folk, what struggles they faced, and what joys they found in their simple lives. Her handmaiden, Catherine, entered the room carrying a basin of warm water, her footsteps soft against the rush-covered floor. Catherine was a woman of perhaps 30 years, with kind brown eyes and graying hair tucked beneath a simple linen cap. She had served Rosalind since the princess was a child, and though their relationship was bound by the rigid structure of class and station, there existed between them a genuine affection that transcended mere duty. "Your Highness, your father the king requests your presence in the great hall within the hour," Catherine said, setting the basin down and curtsying deeply. "He wishes to discuss matters of importance regarding your future." Rosalind felt her stomach tighten with apprehension. She knew exactly what matters her father wished to discuss. King Richard of Ashford had been introducing her to potential suitors with increasing frequency over the past months, each one a lord or prince from distant lands, each one chosen for political advantage rather than any consideration of her happiness or desires. There had been Lord Blackwood, whose breath reeked of wine, and whose eyes held a cruelty that made her skin crawl. Then Prince Aldrich from the Northern Territories, a man twice her age with 3 previous wives who had all died under mysterious circumstances. Most recently, Duke Thornbury, whose conversation consisted entirely of boasts about his hunting prowess and the size of his land holdings. "Catherine," Rosalind said quietly, moving away from the window where she had been staring out at the town below, "tell me truthfully, what do the people of Ashford think of their king? What do they say when they believe no noble ears are listening?" Catherine's expression became guarded, her hands clasping nervously at the folds of her simple woolen dress. "Your Highness, it is not my place to repeat idle gossip or the complaints of common folk." "But I am asking you to," Rosalind insisted, her voice taking on an edge of desperation that surprised even herself. "I have spent my entire life in this castle, Catherine. I know nothing of the real world, nothing of how my father's policies affect the lives of ordinary people. How can I possibly understand my own kingdom when I am kept as isolated as a bird in a cage?" Catherine hesitated, glancing toward the heavy oak door, as if fearing someone might be listening. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The people, they struggle, Your Highness. The taxes have been raised twice in the past year to fund the war with the French territories. Many families can barely afford bread. There is talk of unrest, of hunger in the outlying villages. The king's advisors tell him all is well, but those of us who have family among the common folk, we know differently." Rosalind felt something inside her shift, a crystallization of the vague unease she had felt for so long into something sharper and more focused. "And what of me? What do they say about the princess who lives in luxury while they starve?" "They say nothing ill of you, my lady," Catherine said quickly. They do not know you, and therefore they do not blame you. You are simply distant to them, a figure in a tower, beautiful but unreachable. The word struck Rosalind like a physical blow. She had always imagined herself as someone who cared about her people, who wished them well, but what good were wishes from someone who had never walked among them, never understood their lives? An idea began to form in her mind, wild and dangerous, but once it took root, she could not shake it free. "Catherine," she said slowly, her heart beginning to race with a mixture of fear and excitement, "I need your help with something that must remain absolutely secret." The handmaiden's eyes widened with alarm. "Your Highness, please, do not ask me to do anything that might bring harm to you or dishonor to your position." "No harm will come," Rosalind said, though she could not be entirely certain of that claim. "I simply wish to see my kingdom as it truly is, not through the filtered reports of advisors or the carefully arranged tours where everyone has time to prepare and pretend. I want to walk among my people as one of them, to understand their lives, their struggles, their truths." Catherine shook her head vigorously. "That is far too dangerous, Your Highness. A princess cannot simply walk the streets unprotected. There are dangers you cannot imagine, and if your identity were discovered, which is why no one will discover it," Rosalind interrupted, her resolve hardening. "You will help me disguise myself as a common woman. I will tell my father I am unwell and wish to spend the day in quiet contemplation in my chambers. You will guard the door and turn away any who seek entrance. I will return before nightfall, and no one will be the wiser." The plan was reckless, perhaps even foolish, but Rosalind felt more alive at the prospect than she had in years. Catherine continued to protest, listing all the ways the scheme could go wrong, but eventually, worn down by the princess's determination and unable to deny the genuine desperation in her mistress's eyes, she reluctantly agreed to help. Within the hour, Rosalind stood once again before her mirror, but the reflection that gazed back at her was transformed beyond recognition. Gone were the fine silks and velvets, replaced by a simple dress of rough-spun wool in a drab brown color, patched at the elbows and frayed at the hem. Catherine had braided her distinctive copper hair and hidden it beneath a plain linen cap and hood. Her face, scrubbed clean of the subtle cosmetics she normally wore, looked younger and more vulnerable. A worn cloak of thick wool completed the disguise, and when she looked at herself, Rosalind saw not a princess, but a woman who might work in any kitchen or tend any lord's fields. "You must remember to keep your eyes downcast," Catherine instructed, fussing with the cloak to ensure it covered Rosalind completely. "Common folk do not meet the eyes of their betters directly. And your speech, you must be careful. Your accent, your vocabulary, everything about the way you speak marks you as nobility." "I will be careful," Rosalind promised, though her heart hammered so loudly in her chest she was certain Catherine could hear it. "And you will cover for me? Tell my father I am unwell if he asks." "I will do as you ask, though I fear I am making a terrible mistake," Catherine said, her face lined with worry. "Please, Your Highness, promise me you will stay in the market square, where there are many people. Do not venture into the rougher quarters of town, and return before the sun begins to set." Rosalind embraced her handmaiden impulsively, something that made Catherine stiffen in surprise before awkwardly returning the gesture. "Thank you, Catherine. You have given me a gift more precious than you know." The castle had many passages and stairs that servants used to move about unseen by the nobility, and Catherine guided Rosalind through these hidden ways until they reached a small door that opened into an alley behind the castle kitchens. The smell of baking bread and roasting meat wafted through the air, making Rosalind's stomach rumble despite the breakfast she had eaten earlier. She pulled her hood lower over her face and stepped out into the alley, her heart racing with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. The town of Ashford sprawled below the castle like a living organism, its streets radiating outward in a chaotic web that had grown organically over centuries rather than following any planned design. Rosalind had seen it from her tower windows countless times, but walking through it was an entirely different experience. The cobblestones were slick with morning dew and other substances she preferred not to identify. The buildings leaned toward each other across narrow lanes, their upper stories nearly touching, blocking out much of the sky and creating a sense of claustrophobic intimacy that was both frightening and thrilling. People hurried past her on various errands, and Rosalind marveled at how invisible she had become. Wrapped in her common clothing, she was just another peasant woman, worthy of neither notice nor deference. A man pushing a cart laden with turnips nearly ran into her, barking a curse that made her step quickly aside without thinking to take offense. In the castle, such behavior would have resulted in punishment, but here it was simply the rough rhythm of everyday life. She made her way toward the market square that Catherine had mentioned, following the flow of foot traffic and the increasing noise of commerce. The square opened up before her like a revelation, a vast open space filled with wooden stalls and merchants calling out their wares. The sensory assault was overwhelming. The smell of fresh bread mixing with the tang of leather goods and the earthy scent of vegetables, the cacophony of voices haggling and gossiping and laughing, the visual riot of colors from dyed fabrics and fresh produce and hanging meats. Rosalind moved through the crowd slowly, trying to absorb everything at once. She saw mothers with children clinging to their skirts, their faces lined with the kind of weariness that spoke of endless labor and worry. She saw old men gathered around a well, talking in low voices about crops and weather, and the burden of taxes. She saw young people her own age, but their youth looked different from hers. They were already marked by hard work, their hands rough, their faces weathered despite their years. A commotion near one of the stalls caught her attention. A woman was arguing with a merchant, her voice rising with frustration. "These prices are theft. How am I meant to feed my children when a single loaf costs what I earn in half a day's work?" The merchant, a portly man with a florid face, shrugged without sympathy. "Take it up with the king and his tax collectors. I pay what they demand, and I must make my living too. If you cannot afford my bread, perhaps you should work harder or eat less." The cruelty of the response shocked Rosalind, but what shocked her more was that no one intervened. The other shoppers simply moved around the confrontation, their faces set in expressions of weary acceptance. This was their normal, she realized. This struggle, this callousness, this daily battle for survival. And she, living in her castle with servants bringing her meals she sometimes barely touched, had been completely unaware. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she did not notice the group of young men approaching until one of them deliberately bumped into her, nearly knocking her off balance. There were 3 of them, dressed in slightly better clothing than most of the peasants around them, marking them as perhaps apprentices or sons of merchants. Their eyes held a predatory gleam that made Rosalind's blood run cold. "Well, what have we here?" the tallest one said, looking her up and down with an insolence that would have earned him a flogging in the castle. "A pretty little dove all alone in the market. Where's your husband, girl? Or perhaps you don't have one and you're looking for company." Rosalind's instinct was to draw herself up and speak with the authority of her station, to put these crude young men in their place with a few well-chosen words. But she bit her tongue, remembering Catherine's warnings. She kept her eyes downcast and tried to move past them, but they shifted to block her path. "Don't be rude now," another one said, reaching out to grasp her arm. "We're just being friendly. A girl like you shouldn't be wandering around alone. All sorts of dangers in a place like this." Rosalind tried to pull her arm free, her heart hammering with real fear now. She had been foolish to come here alone, she realized. In the castle, her rank protected her. Here, she was just another vulnerable woman with no one to defend her. She opened her mouth to call for help, though she had no idea if anyone would come to her aid, when a deep voice cut through the confrontation like a blade. "The lady asked you to let her pass. I suggest you do so. Now." The 3 young men turned toward the source of the voice, and Rosalind followed their gaze to see a man approaching from the direction of a blacksmith's forge that stood at the edge of the market square. He was tall, perhaps a head taller than any of the troublemakers, with broad shoulders and muscular arms that spoke of years spent working with hammer and anvil. His age appeared to be close to her own, maybe 25 years at most, and despite the soot that marked his face and the simple leather apron he wore over a coarse linen shirt, there was something undeniably striking about him. His hair was dark as coal, slightly too long, and falling into eyes that were a startling blue, like the sky on a clear winter morning. His face was strong and angular, with a square jaw and features that would have been considered handsome in any social class, though they were currently set in an expression of stern disapproval. The tall troublemaker sneered at the newcomer, though Rosalind noticed he released her arm. "This is none of your concern, Blacksmith. We're just having a friendly conversation with the lady here. It becomes my concern when I see 3 men harassing a woman who clearly wishes to be left alone," the blacksmith replied, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of steel that suggested he was no stranger to confrontation. He moved closer, and Rosalind could see the way his muscles flexed beneath his shirt, the power in his frame that came from years of shaping metal and lifting heavy tools. "I know your fathers, all three of you. I wonder what they would say if they heard their sons were bothering decent women in the marketplace instead of attending to their work." The threat was subtle, but effective. The young men exchanged glances, their bravado deflating slightly. The leader made one last attempt to save face. "We weren't doing any harm, Thomas. Just being friendly, as I said." "Then be friendly somewhere else," Thomas replied, crossing his arms over his chest in a gesture that made his already impressive physique even more imposing. "And I had better not hear of you troubling anyone else, or I will have words with your fathers myself." The three men muttered among themselves, but ultimately decided discretion was the better part of valor. They slunk away into the crowd, casting dark looks over their shoulders but clearly unwilling to challenge the blacksmith further. Rosalind found herself releasing a breath she had not realized she was holding, her hands trembling slightly with the after-effects of fear and the rush of danger narrowly avoided. Thomas turned his attention to her, and his expression softened considerably. Up close, she could see that his face bore a few small scars, likely from sparks or accidents at the forge, but they did nothing to diminish his appearance. If anything, they added to the sense of strength and capability that radiated from him. His eyes, which had been hard as flint when facing the troublemakers, now held genuine concern. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, his voice gentler now. "They didn't hurt you, did they?" Rosalind shook her head, finding her voice somewhat unsteady when she spoke. She reminded herself to keep her accent less refined, to speak as she imagined a common woman might. "No, I'm fine, thanks to you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't intervened." "Nothing good, I suspect," Thomas said with a grimace. "Those three have been causing trouble around town for months now. Their fathers have money and influence, so they think they can do as they please. Someone needs to remind them that decent behavior is expected regardless of one's station." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see through her disguise. "I haven't seen you in Ashford before. Are you new to town?" The question caught Rosalind off guard. She had not prepared a story to explain her presence, foolishly assuming she could simply blend into the crowd unnoticed. Her mind raced, trying to construct a believable lie. Yes, I've just arrived. I'm staying with my aunt for a time. She lives near the East Gate." It was a weak story, and she could see Thomas processing her words, perhaps noting the slight refinement in her speech that she was trying desperately to suppress, or the softness of her hands which had never known hard labor. But if he was suspicious, he was too polite to say so directly. "Well then, welcome to Ashford," he said, offering her a smile that transformed his face entirely, softening the hard edges and revealing a warmth that made something flutter unexpectedly in Rosalind's chest. "I'm Thomas, as those fools mentioned. Thomas the blacksmith, though that probably doesn't narrow it down much. There are 3 other smiths in town, but I like to think my work is the finest." There was no arrogance in the statement, just a simple confidence in his own skills. "I'm Mary," Rosalind said, plucking the first common name that came to mind. "Just Mary. And I'm very grateful for your help, Thomas. I didn't realize the market could be so dangerous." Thomas frowned, and she saw a flash of something like anger cross his features, though it was clearly not directed at her. It shouldn't be. There was a time when Ashford was a safer place, when people looked out for one another and those with means helped those without. But times have grown harder. The king's taxes bleed the people dry, and when folk are desperate, they become either predators or prey. He seemed to catch himself, as if realizing he was speaking too freely about the monarch. "Forgive me, I shouldn't burden a stranger with such talk. It's just frustrating to see what's become of this town." Rosalind wanted desperately to ask more, to understand exactly how her father's policies were affecting these people, but she forced herself to hold back. Too many questions would mark her as unusual, and she was already walking a precarious line. Instead, she said, "You seem like someone who cares about the welfare of others. That's rare, I think." "Not as rare as you might believe," Thomas replied, though his expression remained troubled. "Most people here are good folk at heart. They help their neighbors when they can, share what little they have. But there's only so much sharing that can be done when everyone is struggling. What we need is change from above, from those who have the power to make things better but choose not to use it." He shook his head as if trying to dispel dark thoughts. "But I'm keeping you from your errands with my complaints. Can I escort you somewhere? Make sure no one else bothers you." The offer was kindly meant, and Rosalind found herself wanting to accept more than was perhaps wise. There was something about this man, this blacksmith who stood up to bullies and spoke with passion about justice and community, that drew her in. But she also knew she needed to be careful. She had come to observe and learn, not to form attachments that could complicate everything. "I was just exploring the market," she said carefully. "I don't have any particular destination, but I would appreciate some company if you can spare the time. I imagine you have work waiting." Thomas glanced back toward his forge, where she could see smoke rising from the chimney. "I do have a commission I should finish, but it can wait a bit longer. The merchant who ordered it won't need it until tomorrow, and I'd feel better knowing you got back to your aunt's house safely. The market can be confusing for newcomers, and not everyone you meet will be as pleasant as I am." He said this last part with a self-deprecating grin that made Rosalind smile in return despite herself. They began walking together through the market, and Thomas proved to be an excellent guide. He pointed out the various stalls and shops, explaining which merchants were honest and which had a tendency to cheat on their weights and measures. He showed her the well where the cleanest water could be drawn, and the baker whose bread was worth the slightly higher price because he did not stretch his flour with sawdust as some others did. As they walked, he nodded greetings to dozens of people, clearly well-known and well-liked in the community. Rosalind found herself watching him more than the market. There was an ease to the way he moved, a confidence born not of noble privilege but of genuine capability. His hands, scarred and calloused from his work, moved expressively as he talked, and she found herself fascinated by the contrast between his physical strength and the gentleness with which he treated her, always careful to keep a respectful distance and never touching her without permission. "You said you're a blacksmith," she ventured as they paused near a stall selling leather goods. "How did you come to that trade?" Thomas's expression grew more solemn. "My father was a blacksmith before me and his father before that. I learned the craft at my father's knee from the time I was old enough to pump the bellows. He died 3 years ago during a particularly harsh winter. The cold settled into his lungs and never left." He paused, and Rosalind could see the grief still present in his eyes. "My mother followed him not 6 months later. The physician said it was a fever, but I think it was really a broken heart. They had been together since they were 15 years old." "I'm so sorry," Rosalind said, and the sympathy in her voice was entirely genuine. She had lost her own mother when she was young, though in her case, it had been during childbirth. The baby, a brother she had never known, had died as well. It must be difficult, carrying on alone. "I have my work," Thomas said simply, "and I have the community here. People look out for each other, as I said. When my parents died, neighbors brought food, helped with arrangements, made sure I didn't fall into despair. I try to repay that kindness by looking out for others in turn." He gestured toward the forge in the distance. "The work itself is satisfying too. There's something honest about shaping metal, about taking raw materials and creating something useful with your own 2 hands. Every horseshoe, every hinge, every blade I make serves a purpose. It's more meaningful than I think many nobles understand, wrapped up as they are in their games of politics and power." Rosalind felt a pang at his words, recognizing the implicit criticism of her own class. And yet, could she really argue with him? What had she ever created or contributed? She had been educated in music and literature, taught to dance and to make pleasant conversation, trained in all the accomplishments expected of a noble lady. But what real value did any of that have? Could her ability to embroider or play the lute feed anyone? Could her knowledge of courtly etiquette help a struggling family survive the winter? "Do you truly believe all nobles are so disconnected from their people?" she asked, trying to keep her voice neutral, as if the question were merely academic rather than deeply personal. Thomas considered this carefully, clearly not wanting to offend but also unwilling to dissemble. "I think that most nobles, even those who believe they mean well, live in a different world from the rest of us. They see numbers on ledgers rather than hungry children. They see tax revenue rather than families forced to choose between buying bread or keeping their homes warm. I'm sure many of them are kind to their servants, generous to their favorites, perhaps even occasionally charitable to the poor. But true understanding, true empathy, that requires walking in someone else's shoes, experiencing their struggles firsthand. And how many nobles would ever be willing to do that?" His words struck Rosalind like hammer blows, each one true and damning. She had come here today thinking to observe, to understand, to perhaps gain some insight that would make her a better ruler someday. But Thomas was right. Observation from a distance was not the same as true understanding. Even now, disguised as a common woman, she knew she would return to her castle at day's end, to her soft bed and her warm meals and her life of privilege. What she was doing was little more than play acting, a temporary adventure that cost her nothing and changed nothing. "You've gone very quiet," Thomas observed, his tone gentle. "I hope I haven't offended you with my talk. I have a tendency to speak too freely about such things. My friends tell me I should learn to hold my tongue, that my opinions will get me in trouble someday." "No, you haven't offended me," Rosalind assured him quickly. "I was just thinking about what you said. You're right, I think, about the distance between those who have power and those who don't. I wish I knew how to bridge that gap." Thomas looked at her with surprise, and then with something that might have been respect. "The fact that you would even consider such a question marks you as unusual, Mary. Most people are content to accept the world as it is, to focus on their own survival and not trouble themselves with larger concerns. But change has to start somewhere, with someone willing to imagine that things could be different." They had walked while talking, and Rosalind realized they had moved beyond the main market square into a quieter section of town. The buildings here were older, some showing signs of disrepair, and the people they passed looked even more worn and weary than those in the market. Children with dirty faces and patched clothing played in the street, and an old woman sat in a doorway, her gnarled hands working at some mending, even as her eyes stared into the distance with the blank expression of someone who had seen too much hardship. "This is the oldest part of Ashford," Thomas explained, following her gaze. "Many of these families have lived here for generations. They're good people, hard workers, but they've been hit particularly hard by the recent tax increases. Several of the houses stand empty now because the families couldn't pay and were forced to leave, seeking work in other towns or, in some cases, turning to begging or worse." "Where does the tax money go?" Rosalind asked, though she feared she knew the answer. Her father's treasury funded the ongoing border conflicts, the maintenance of the castle and the army, the lavish feasts and entertainments that were considered essential to demonstrating royal power and prestige. "The war, mostly," Thomas said, his voice bitter. "A war that most of us don't understand and certainly didn't ask for. The king and his advisors play their games of conquest and alliance, and we pay the price in coin and blood. Young men are conscripted from their families to fight in distant lands for causes they don't believe in, and those of us who remain must work twice as hard to make up for their absence." Rosalind felt shame wash over her like a cold wave. She had attended council meetings where these very policies were discussed, sitting silently in the corner as her father and his advisors debated strategies and resource allocations. She had heard the numbers, seen the maps with their colored pins marking territories and troop movements, but she had never truly connected those abstract discussions to the reality standing before her now. Empty houses, hungry children, families torn apart. The weight of her complicity, even if passive, settled heavily on her shoulders. "I can see this troubles you," Thomas said, misinterpreting her distress as simple sympathy rather than the deeper guilt it truly was. "You have a kind heart, Mary. That's rare enough these days." He paused at a corner where the street split in two directions. "I should probably get back to my forge soon, but I want to make sure you can find your way to your aunt's house safely. You said she lives near the east gate." Rosalind realized with a start that she had claimed to have an aunt in that direction, a lie she now had to maintain. "Yes, but I'm not ready to return just yet." "I'd like to see more of the town, if that's all right. Perhaps I could visit your forge? I've never seen a blacksmith at work before." The invitation was bold, perhaps too bold for a proper young woman, but Rosalind found she desperately wanted to extend her time with Thomas, not just because his presence made her feel safe in this unfamiliar environment, but because talking with him had opened her eyes in ways she had not anticipated. He represented something she had never encountered in the castle: honest, direct communication untainted by political maneuvering or the careful dance of courtly speech. When he spoke of injustice, his anger was real. When he showed compassion, it came from genuine feeling rather than calculated advantage. Thomas looked surprised by her request, but not displeased. "I suppose there's no harm in it, though I should warn you, a forge is hot, noisy, and dirty. Not exactly a pleasant place for a lady to spend her time." "I'd still like to see it," Rosalind insisted. Besides, I'm hardly a lady. Just a common woman, same as any other. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes at her words, and she wondered if he suspected her deception. But he simply nodded and gestured for her to follow him back toward the market square and the forge that stood at its edge. As they walked, he continued to share observations about the town and its people, pointing out small details she would never have noticed on her own. The way certain shop owners gave credit to struggling families, how the tavern keeper allowed men who had fallen on hard times to work off their debts by helping in the kitchen, the widow who shared her small garden's harvest with neighbors who had no land of their own. "There's a lot of hardship here," Thomas said, "but there's also resilience and generosity. People understand that we're all in this together, that helping your neighbor today might mean your neighbor helps you tomorrow. It's a lesson those in the castle could benefit from learning." The forge came into view, a sturdy stone building with a thatched roof and a wide opening in the front where the heat could escape. Even from a distance, Rosalind could feel the warmth radiating from the structure, and as they drew closer, she could hear the rhythmic clang of metal on metal. A younger man, perhaps 17 or 18 years old, was working the bellows, his face red from exertion and heat. He looked up when Thomas approached, relief evident in his expression. "Thank God you're back," the young man said, wiping sweat from his brow with a cloth that left a streak of soot across his forehead. "I've been keeping the fire hot like you asked, but I wasn't sure how long you'd be gone, and that merchant from the market sent his boy by to ask about his order, and I didn't know what to tell him." "Easy, Peter," Thomas said with a laugh, clapping the younger man on the shoulder. "You did well. Tell me the fire's been steady?" "Steady as I could keep it," Peter confirmed, then noticed Rosalind standing a respectful distance away. His eyes widened slightly, and he looked between her and Thomas with obvious curiosity. "Peter, this is Mary," Thomas introduced them. "She's new to Ashford and was kind enough to express interest in seeing the forge. Mary, this is Peter, my apprentice. He's been learning the trade for 2 years now and is coming along well, though he still has much to learn." Peter ducked his head in acknowledgement, his cheeks reddening further, though whether from the heat or embarrassment, Rosalind could not tell. "Pleased to meet you, miss. Thomas is a good master, patient and skilled. I'm lucky to be learning from him. Peter comes from one of the families I mentioned earlier," Thomas explained, moving toward a workbench where various tools hung on the wall in careful arrangement. "His father was conscripted 6 months ago, sent to fight in the border territories. His mother struggles to feed Peter and his 3 younger sisters on what she earns doing laundry and mending. Taking Peter as an apprentice means one less mouth for her to feed, and when he completes his training, he'll have a trade that can support the whole family." The casual way Thomas spoke of this arrangement made it clear he saw it as simply the right thing to do, not something deserving of special praise. But Rosalind understood the significance of what he had done. Taking an apprentice meant sharing his knowledge, his workspace, and inevitably some of his profits with someone who might one day become a competitor. It was an act of generosity disguised as practicality. "Now then," Thomas said, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms marked with old burn scars and corded with muscle. "What would you like to see? I have that commission to finish, a set of hinges for the merchant's new warehouse. Nothing particularly exciting, but necessary work." Rosalind moved closer to the forge, fascinated despite the intense heat that made sweat immediately bead on her skin. The fire glowed orange and yellow in the hearth, the coals pulsing with heat as Peter worked the bellows. Thomas selected a piece of iron from a pile near the wall, examining it with a critical eye before thrusting it into the heart of the flames. "The key to good metalwork is understanding the material," Thomas explained as he waited for the iron to heat. "Iron has to reach the right temperature. Too cool and you can't shape it properly. Too hot and it becomes brittle and weak. You learn to read the color of the metal, to know by sight when it's ready." He spoke with such evident passion that Rosalind found herself drawn in despite her complete ignorance of the subject. When the iron began to glow a bright orange red, Thomas pulled it from the fire with a pair of long tongs and moved swiftly to the anvil. The hammer he lifted seemed impossibly heavy, but he wielded it with practiced ease, bringing it down on the glowing metal in a series of controlled strikes that sent sparks flying and filled the air with the ringing sound of steel on iron. Rosalind watched, mesmerized by the transformation taking place before her eyes. Under Thomas's skilled hands, the rough piece of iron began to take shape, bending and flattening into something purposeful. His movements were economical and precise, each hammer blow placed exactly where it needed to be. Sweat ran down his face and soaked through his shirt, making the fabric cling to the muscles of his back and shoulders, but he seemed entirely focused on his work, unconscious of anything else. When the metal cooled too much to work effectively, he thrust it back into the fire and waited for it to reheat before returning to the anvil. The process repeated several times, and Rosalind found herself holding her breath during each cycle, watching the crude iron transform gradually into an elegant hinge with scrollwork at its ends. Finally, Thomas plunged the finished piece into a barrel of water, and the liquid erupted with a violent hiss and a cloud of steam. When he lifted the hinge out and examined it, turning it this way and that in the light, a small smile of satisfaction crossed his face. "There," he said, setting it aside to cool completely. "One hinge done, 7 more to go. The merchant wants them all by tomorrow evening, so I'll be working late tonight." He looked at Rosalind and must have seen something in her expression because his smile widened. "You look amazed. I assure you this is very ordinary work. Nothing special about it." "I disagree," Rosalind said, meaning it completely. "I've never seen anything like it. The way you shaped the metal, made it into something beautiful and useful. It's like artistry and craft combined. And you do this every day?" "Every day," Thomas confirmed, looking pleased by her praise despite his attempt at modesty. "Sometimes the work is more interesting. A fine sword for a nobleman, decorative ironwork for a church, a special tool designed for a specific purpose. Other times it's just horseshoes and nails and hinges. But even the simple work has its own satisfaction. Someone needs those horseshoes. Someone will use those hinges for years, perhaps decades. In a small way, I'm helping to build and maintain the world around me." Peter had been watching this exchange with barely concealed amusement, and when Thomas turned to check the fire, the apprentice caught Rosalind's eye and gave her a knowing grin that made her cheeks heat with something other than the forge's warmth. She wondered what assumptions the young man was making about her presence here, what story he was constructing in his mind. "Peter, why don't you take a break?" Thomas suggested, apparently oblivious to his apprentice's thoughts. "Go get yourself something to drink and eat. You've been working hard all morning." The apprentice needed no further encouragement. He pulled off his heavy leather apron, hung it on a peg near the door, and headed out into the market with the energy of youth momentarily freed from responsibility. His departure left Rosalind alone with Thomas in the forge, a situation that would have been scandalous if anyone knew her true identity, but which, in her current disguise, was merely slightly improper. Thomas selected another piece of iron and thrust it into the fire, but before beginning work on the next hinge, he turned to face her fully. His expression had grown more serious, and there was a searching quality to his gaze that made Rosalind's heart beat faster. "Mary," he said carefully, "I hope you'll forgive me for saying this, but there's something about you that doesn't quite fit. The way you speak, the way you carry yourself, even the way you look at common things as if seeing them for the first time, it all suggests you're not quite what you claim to be." Rosalind felt panic flutter in her chest. Had she been so transparent? Had all her careful attempts at disguise been for nothing? She opened her mouth to protest, to maintain her fiction, but Thomas held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself," he continued. "Everyone has their reasons for privacy, for keeping certain things to themselves. God knows I'm not one to judge, but I want you to know that if you're in some kind of trouble, if you're running from something or someone, I would help you if I could. No questions asked." The offer was so unexpected, so genuinely kind, that Rosalind felt tears prick at her eyes. Here was a man who had known her for mere hours, who believed her to be a common woman of no particular importance, and yet he offered his help freely, asking nothing in return. The contrast with the calculated relationships of the court, where every favor came with strings attached and every alliance was built on mutual advantage, could not have been more stark. "I'm not in trouble," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion she struggled to control. "At least, not in the way you mean. I'm just trying to understand the world better, trying to see things clearly instead of through the distorted lens I've been looking through all my life." Thomas nodded slowly, as if her cryptic answer made perfect sense to him. "That's a noble pursuit, I think. Too few people bother to question what they've been taught or to look beyond their own narrow experience. The fact that you're making the effort speaks well of you." He pulled the heated iron from the fire and returned to the anvil. and for a while they worked in companionable silence, Thomas shaping metal and Rosalind watching and learning. She asked questions about the process, and he answered patiently, explaining the properties of different metals, the techniques for creating various effects, the mathematics and geometry involved in creating pieces that fit together properly. His knowledge was deep and practical, earned through years of hands-on experience rather than book learning, but no less valid for that. As the afternoon wore on, Rosalind became aware of the passage of time with growing anxiety. She had promised Catherine she would return before sunset, and the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting longer shadows across the market square. Reluctantly, she knew she had to leave, had to return to the castle before her absence was discovered, and questions were asked that she could not answer. "I should go," she said, interrupting Thomas mid-sentence as he explained the process of tempering steel. "My aunt will worry if I'm gone too long." Thomas set down his hammer and wiped his hands on a cloth, his expression showing clear disappointment at her departure. "Of course, I shouldn't have kept you so long. Let me at least walk you part of the way back to the East Gate." "That's not necessary," Rosalind protested, knowing she could not actually go to the East Gate without risking exposure. "You have work to finish, and I've already taken up too much of your time." "I insist," Thomas said firmly, removing his leather apron and hanging it beside Peter's. "It will be dark soon, and I meant what I said earlier about the town not being entirely safe, especially for a woman alone. Besides, I could use the fresh air after being in the forge all afternoon." He called out toward the back of the workshop, where Peter had returned and was sorting through a pile of scrap metal. "Peter, keep the fire banked and don't try to work on any of the hinges yourself. I'll be back within the hour." The apprentice waved acknowledgement, and Thomas gestured for Rosalind to precede him out of the forge. The late afternoon air felt almost cool after the intense heat of the workspace, and Rosalind took a deep breath, trying to clear the smell of smoke and hot metal from her lungs. The market was less crowded now, many of the merchants beginning to pack up their wares for the day, and the quality of light had taken on that golden cast particular to the hours before sunset. They walked in silence for a few minutes, and Rosalind's mind raced with the problem of how to extract herself from this situation without either hurting Thomas's feelings or revealing her deception. She could not let him accompany her all the way to the East Gate, but neither could she simply disappear without explanation. As they walked, she became acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. Thomas was clearly well known in the community, and his presence with an unfamiliar woman was apparently noteworthy. "People are staring," she murmured, keeping her voice low. Thomas glanced around and then smiled ruefully. "Ashford is a small town in many ways. People notice things and they talk. By tomorrow morning, half the market will have heard that I was seen walking with a pretty stranger, and by tomorrow afternoon, the other half will have invented an entire romance between us." He paused, then added more seriously, "I apologize if that troubles you. I wasn't thinking about how it might affect your reputation." "I'm not worried about my reputation," Rosalind said, which was true in a way he could not understand. Her reputation as Princess Rosalind was safe as long as no one discovered her identity, and as for the reputation of Mary, a woman who did not actually exist, that hardly mattered. What did trouble her, though she could not quite articulate why, was the idea of being the subject of gossip, of having her interactions with Thomas analyzed and speculated upon by strangers. They had reached a small church near the edge of the market square, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and rain. Thomas paused there, seeming to come to a decision about something. When he spoke, his words came slowly, carefully chosen. "Mary, I know we've only just met, and perhaps I'm being presumptuous, but I would very much like to see you again. Tomorrow, if possible, or whenever you can spare the time. I realize that sounds forward, especially given that you're staying with family and probably have obligations, but—" He trailed off, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I enjoyed your company today. It's rare to meet someone who asks genuine questions and seems truly interested in understanding, rather than just making polite conversation." Rosalind's heart clenched at the sincerity in his voice and the hope in his eyes. Every rational part of her mind screamed that she should refuse, should make a clean break now before this situation became even more complicated. She had come to town to observe and learn, not to form personal connections that could never lead anywhere. What future could there possibly be for a princess and a blacksmith, The very idea was absurd, the stuff of fairy tales rather than reality. And yet, when she opened her mouth to politely decline, different words emerged. I would like that as well. Very much. But I need to be honest with you, Thomas. My situation is complicated. There are things about me I cannot explain, and circumstances that may prevent me from seeing you as often as either of us might wish. I understand complicated, Thomas replied, though it was clear he did not truly understand at all. How could he? And I'm not asking for promises or commitments, just the chance to spend more time together, to talk and perhaps to know each other better. If that's all it can be, then I'll be grateful for that much. The simplicity of his request, the modesty of his expectations, made Rosalind want to weep. In the castle, every relationship was transactional, every friendship calculated for advantage. Here was a man asking for nothing more than her company, offering his own in return, with no ulterior motives or hidden agendas. It was so pure, so genuine, that she could not bring herself to refuse. Tomorrow afternoon, then, she heard herself say. Perhaps we could meet here, at this church. Around midday. Thomas's face lit up with a smile that transformed his already handsome features into something radiant. Tomorrow at midday. I'll be here. And Mary? He reached out as if to take her hand, then seemed to think better of it and let his arm drop back to his side. Thank you, for today, for listening, for caring about things that most people in your position wouldn't bother with. My position? Rosalind asked, startled by the phrasing. A newcomer to town, Thomas clarified. Most people are so focused on establishing themselves, on finding work or making connections that will benefit them, that they don't take time to understand the community they've joined. You're different. Rosalind felt a wave of guilt at his interpretation, knowing that her true position was so far removed from what he imagined. But she simply nodded and said, I'll see you tomorrow, Thomas. She left him standing by the church and hurried away, taking a circuitous route through the narrower streets to ensure he could not follow her progress. Her heart hammered with a mixture of excitement, anxiety, and a growing sense that she had just made a decision that would change everything, though she could not yet see how or why. The sun was sinking lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and she knew she needed to return to the castle quickly before her absence became impossible to explain. Finding her way back to the hidden servants' entrance proved more difficult than she had anticipated. In her eagerness to explore, she had not paid careful attention to the route, and the twisting streets all looked similar in the fading light. She took several wrong turns, backtracking when she found herself in unfamiliar areas, and by the time she finally recognized the alley behind the castle kitchens, the sun had nearly set and panic had begun to claw at her chest. Catherine was waiting just inside the door, her face pale with worry that turned to relief when she saw Rosalind. Thank the heavens you've returned. I've been terrified something had happened to you. The king sent for you twice this afternoon, and I told him you were sleeping due to illness, but he's growing suspicious. He wants to see you at dinner, which begins in less than an hour. Rosalind allowed Catherine to hustle her through the servants' passages and back to her chambers, where the handmaiden quickly helped her out of the peasant clothes and into a bath that had been prepared. As Catherine scrubbed the day's grime from her skin and worked to remove the tangles from her hair, Rosalind's mind wandered back to the forge, to Thomas's strong hands shaping metal, to the passion in his voice when he spoke of justice and community, to the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. Your Highness, you're smiling, Catherine observed, her tone a mixture of concern and curiosity. What happened out there today? Did you learn what you hoped to learn? I learned more than I expected, Rosalind replied softly. I saw how our people truly live, Catherine. The struggles they face, the hardships they endure because of policies made by people like my father who have never walked those streets or felt that hunger. I saw cruelty and kindness, desperation and generosity. And I met someone. She trailed off, unsure how to explain. You met someone? Catherine repeated, her hand stilling in Rosalind's hair. Your Highness, please tell me you didn't form an attachment to anyone. That would be dangerous beyond measure. I know it's dangerous, Rosalind admitted. I know it's foolish and impossible and can lead nowhere good. But Catherine, when I was with him, I felt more alive, more real, than I have in years within these walls. He treated me as an equal, spoke to me honestly, asked nothing of me except to listen and understand. How can I not want more of that? Catherine resumed her work with a heavy sigh. Because you are not Mary the peasant woman, your highness. You are Princess Rosalind, heir to the throne of Ashford. Whatever feelings you may have developed today, they cannot change that reality. And the longer you pursue this deception, the greater the pain will be when it inevitably ends. I know, Rosalind whispered, but even as she said it, she was already planning how she would disguise herself again tomorrow, how she would slip away to meet Thomas at the church, how she would continue this impossible charade for as long as she could make it last. By the time Catherine had finished preparing her, Rosalind looked every inch the princess again. Her copper hair had been arranged in an elaborate style with small jewels woven throughout, and she wore a gown of deep green velvet with gold embroidery at the cuffs and neckline. A delicate circlet of gold sat upon her brow, and soft leather slippers replaced the rough wooden clogs she had worn through the town. The transformation was complete, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman who had walked through the market mere hours ago. Dinner in the great hall was a formal affair, as it always was. King Richard sat at the head of the long table, resplendent in robes of purple and gold, his crown heavy upon his graying head. He was a man in his late 50s, still strong, but beginning to show his age in the lines around his eyes and the slight stoop to his shoulders. Rosalind's resemblance to him was unmistakable in the shape of her face and the color of her eyes, though she had inherited her mother's delicate features and copper hair. Seated around the table were various nobles and advisors, each vying for the king's attention with carefully rehearsed comments and observations. Lord Chancellor Pembroke, a thin man with a calculating expression, was discussing tax revenues from the northern territories. Sir Geoffrey, the commander of the King's Guard, reported on troop movements along the border. Lady Ashworth, one of the few women of rank at court, made witty observations about the latest fashions from the continent that had the king chuckling despite the serious topics under discussion. Rosalind took her seat at her father's right hand, murmuring apologies for her late arrival and her absence earlier in the day. King Richard waved off her concerns, though his eyes studied her face with an intensity that made her nervous. "Catherine tells me you were feeling unwell," he said once the servants had brought the first course, a rich soup made with vegetables and mutton. "You seem recovered now." "I trust it was nothing serious." "Just a headache, father," Rosalind replied, grateful that the lie came easily to her lips after a lifetime of courtly deception in other forms. "The warmth of my chambers and some rest were all I needed." The king nodded, apparently satisfied with her explanation, and turned his attention back to the conversation around him. But Rosalind noticed that, throughout the meal, his gaze would occasionally drift back to her, as if he sensed something different about her, but could not quite identify what had changed. She forced herself to eat the elaborate dishes placed before her: roasted fowl with herb sauce, fresh bread with butter, honeyed fruits, and rich pastries, all the while thinking of the woman she had seen arguing with the merchant about the price of a single loaf, of the empty houses in the old quarter, of families struggling to survive on what her father's court spent on a single evening's entertainment. Lord Pembroke was in the middle of a lengthy explanation of proposed new tariffs on grain imports when the king suddenly interrupted him. "Enough talk of taxes and trade for one evening. I have more pleasant matters to discuss." He turned to Rosalind with an expression that made her stomach sink. "Daughter, I have received word from the court of King Philip. His son, Prince Alexander, will be arriving next week to pay us a visit. He has expressed interest in making your acquaintance." The announcement was met with murmurs of approval from the assembled nobles. Lady Ashworth leaned forward with obvious delight. "Prince Alexander, what a wonderful prospect, your majesty. I have heard he is quite handsome and well educated, fluent in multiple languages, and skilled in both warfare and diplomacy. He is also," the king added significantly, "heir to one of the wealthiest kingdoms on the continent. An alliance through marriage would strengthen our position considerably, provide resources for our ongoing conflicts, and secure our borders for generations to come." Rosalind felt the walls of the great hall pressing in on her, the air becoming thick and difficult to breathe. Another suitor, another political arrangement, another man chosen for her based on strategic advantage, rather than any consideration of compatibility or affection. And this time the pressure would be even greater because the prize was so valuable from her father's perspective. "Father," she said carefully, aware that everyone at the table was listening, "I appreciate your efforts to secure my future, but I have told you repeatedly that I wish to have some say in whom I marry. I will not be bartered away like a piece of property, however advantageous the alliance might be." A hush fell over the table. King Richard's expression darkened, and for a moment Rosalind thought he might lose his temper, but he controlled himself with visible effort. When he spoke, his voice was cold and hard. "You are a princess, Rosalind. Your duty is to your kingdom, not to your own whims and fancies. You will meet Prince Alexander when he arrives. You will be gracious and welcoming, and you will give him fair consideration. That is not a request. And if I find him unsuitable," Rosalind challenged, knowing she was pushing too far, but unable to stop herself. The contrast between her father's authoritarian demands and Thomas's respectful treatment of her as an equal was too stark, too fresh in her mind. "You will find a way to make the match work," the king said flatly. "I have been patient with your reluctance, daughter, more patient than many fathers would be, but my patience has limits. You are 22 years old, well past the age when most noble women are married and producing heirs. It is time for you to accept your responsibilities." Rosalind wanted to argue further, to point out that her responsibilities might extend beyond merely producing heirs and cementing alliances, that perhaps a ruler's duty also included understanding and caring for their people. But she could see from her father's expression that further protest would only make the situation worse. She lowered her eyes and murmured, "As you wish, father." The rest of the meal passed in strained silence, at least as far as Rosalind was concerned. The nobles resumed their discussions of politics and court gossip, but she barely heard them, lost in her own troubled thoughts. When the dinner finally concluded and she was able to excuse herself, she fled to her chambers with a relief that bordered on desperation. Catherine was waiting there, having already laid out Rosalind's nightclothes and turned down the bed. One look at the princess's face told her something had gone wrong. What happened? Rosalind sank onto the edge of her bed, suddenly exhausted. "Another suitor, Prince Alexander of King Philip's court, arriving next week. My father has made it clear that he expects this match to succeed, that my continued resistance will no longer be tolerated." "Oh, your highness," Catherine said softly, sitting beside her in a breach of protocol that spoke to the depth of their relationship. "I am sorry, but perhaps this prince will be different from the others. Perhaps you could find happiness with him." "How can I find happiness with someone chosen for political convenience?" Rosalind asked bitterly. "How can I even contemplate marriage to a stranger when I have finally met someone who sees me as a person, rather than a prize to be won or a tool to be used?" Catherine's expression grew troubled. "You're speaking of the man you met today, the blacksmith? His name is Thomas," Rosalind said, and just speaking his name aloud made her feel better somehow, as if it made him more real, more present even in his absence. "And yes, I'm speaking of him. Catherine, when I was with him today, I felt like myself for the first time in my life. Not Princess Rosalind, not the king's daughter, not a political asset, just a woman talking to a man, sharing ideas and learning from each other. He offered to help me if I was in trouble, asking nothing in return. He spoke of justice and community, and the responsibility we all have to look out for one another. He was kind to his apprentice, respectful to me, honest about his opinions even when they might cause him trouble. How can I marry some prince I've never met when I've finally found someone who represents everything I've been looking for? Because Thomas is a blacksmith and you are a princess," Catherine said gently but firmly. "Because the world does not work according to our wishes or our hearts. Because your father is the king and he has commanded you to do your duty. I understand that you care for this man, your highness, truly I do. But you must see that there is no future there, no possibility of happiness down that path." Rosalind knew Catherine was right, knew it with her mind even as her heart rebelled against the truth. But she also knew that she was not ready to give up. "Not yet. I'm going to see him again tomorrow. I've already arranged to meet him at midday." "Your highness, that is unwise." "I know it's unwise," Rosalind interrupted, her voice rising with frustration. "I know it's dangerous and foolish and can only end badly. But I'm going anyway, Catherine. I need to. Just for a little while longer, I need to be Mary instead of Rosalind. I need to live in a world where my choices matter and my feelings are my own." "Is that really so much to ask?" Catherine looked at her with such sadness that Rosalind felt ashamed of her outburst. "No, your highness. It's not too much to ask. It's what everyone deserves. But deserving something and being able to have it are two different things, especially for people in our positions. I will help you tomorrow, as I helped you today. But please, I beg you, be careful. Guard your heart as well as your identity, because losing either one will bring you nothing but pain. That night, Rosalind lay awake for hours, staring at the canopy above her bed and thinking about the impossible situation she had created for herself. Part of her, the rational, dutiful part that had been trained since childhood to think of kingdom before self, knew that she should end this deception now, before it went any further. She should accept her father's decree, meet Prince Alexander with an open mind, and do her duty as a princess of Ashford. But another part of her, a part that had only recently awakened and was growing stronger by the hour, refused to surrender so easily. This part argued that she had spent her entire life being dutiful, being obedient, sacrificing her own desires for the good of the kingdom. Was it really so terrible to want something for herself, even if only for a brief time? Was it wrong to seek happiness, to explore feelings that made her feel alive and real and valued? By the time dawn began to lighten the sky outside her window, Rosalind had made her decision. She would see Thomas again tomorrow, and perhaps the day after that as well. She would take these stolen moments of freedom while she could, would be merry for as long as the deception could be maintained. And when the inevitable end came, when Prince Alexander arrived, when her father's patience ran out, when her true identity was discovered, she would face those consequences. But not yet, not today. The next morning seemed to pass with agonizing slowness. Rosalind attended her lessons with her tutors, sat through a meeting with her father's advisors where various petitions from the nobility were discussed, and endured a fitting for new gowns that would be appropriate for receiving a visiting prince. Through it all, her mind was on the church where she would meet Thomas, on what they might talk about, on how it would feel to see him again. Catherine helped her change into the peasant disguise around mid-morning, fussing even more than the previous day about ensuring every detail was correct. "Your father is occupied with military matters," the handmaiden reported. "He should be in council for most of the afternoon, but you must be back before evening, Your Highness. The longer you're gone, the greater the risk of discovery." Rosalind promised to be careful, then made her way through the castle's hidden passages and out into the town. The day was overcast, with heavy clouds threatening rain, and the market square was less crowded than it had been the day before. She made her way to the church where she had parted from Thomas, her heart beating faster with each step, half afraid he would not be there, half afraid of what it would mean if he was. But he was there, standing near the church entrance, looking almost as nervous as she felt. He had cleaned up since the previous day, his face scrubbed free of soot and his hair combed back, though it still fell forward into his eyes in a way that made her want to brush it aside. He wore a clean shirt of undyed linen and a leather vest, simple clothing but well made, and when he saw her approaching, his entire face lit up with a smile that made her breath catch. "Mary," he said, stepping forward to meet her. "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't come, or that I had imagined yesterday entirely that you were too good to be real." "I'm real," Rosalind assured him, returning his smile despite the guilt that gnawed at her for the deception she was perpetuating. "And I promised I would come, didn't I? I don't break my promises." "I'm glad to hear it," Thomas said. "I've been thinking about what we might do today. The weather doesn't look promising for walking around town, so I thought perhaps you might like to see something different. There's a place just outside Ashford, about a half-hour's walk, where there's an old ruin, the remains of a watchtower from centuries ago. It's a bit of a climb to reach it, but the view from the top is spectacular. You can see for miles in every direction." The suggestion was so unexpected that Rosalind hesitated. Leaving the town meant going even further from the castle, being away even longer, increasing the risk of her absence being noted. But it also meant more time alone with Thomas, away from prying eyes and curious gossip. The cautious part of her counseled refusal, but that part was growing quieter by the hour. "That sounds wonderful," she heard herself say. "I'd love to see it." They set off together, walking through the town and out past the eastern gate that Rosalind had claimed to be staying near. The guards there barely glanced at them, accustomed to seeing townspeople coming and going throughout the day. Once outside the walls, the landscape opened up into rolling hills dotted with small farms and patches of forest. The road was well-worn but narrow, and as they walked, Thomas pointed out various landmarks and shared stories about the area. "My father used to bring me out here when I was a boy," he said, gesturing toward a particularly large oak tree standing alone in a field. He said that tree had been there for hundreds of years, that it had probably witnessed more history than any book could record. He loved to speculate about what it might have seen: armies marching past, lovers meeting in its shade, children playing beneath its branches across the generations. Rosalind found herself charmed by the image of a young Thomas walking these same paths with his father, learning to see the world through eyes that valued history and connection rather than mere utility. "Your father sounds like he was a thoughtful man. You must miss him terribly." "Every day," Thomas admitted, his expression growing somber. "He taught me everything important, not just the craft of blacksmithing, but how to be a good man, how to treat people with dignity regardless of their station, how to find meaning in honest work. He never had much in terms of material wealth, but he was rich in the things that truly matter: friends who would help him in times of need, the respect of his community, a loving wife, a son he was proud of." He paused, then added more quietly, "I hope I've lived up to his example. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I'm making the kind of difference he would have wanted me to make." "I think you are," Rosalind said with conviction, "taking in Peter as an apprentice, standing up to those young men who were bothering me, speaking out about injustice even when it might be safer to remain silent. Those are all the actions of someone living according to strong principles. Your father would be proud. I'm certain of it." Thomas looked at her with such gratitude that she felt her heart swell. There was something profoundly intimate about this conversation, about the way they were sharing pieces of themselves with each other. In the castle, conversations were carefully orchestrated performances, each word chosen for effect, every revelation calculated. But here, walking along a country road with the wind picking up and the smell of rain in the air, she and Thomas were simply two people trying to know and understand each other. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, and Rosalind found herself noticing details she would never have seen from a carriage window or a castle tower. The way the light changed as clouds moved across the sun, casting shifting shadows over the landscape. The sound of birds calling to each other from the hedgerows. The feel of the packed earth beneath her feet, so different from the smooth stone floors of her chambers. The sheer physicality of walking, of using her body for transportation rather than being carried, made her feel more present, more connected to the world around her. After about 30 minutes, as Thomas had predicted, they reached the base of a hill that rose more steeply than those around it. At its summit, Rosalind could see the crumbling remains of stone walls, partially obscured by vegetation that had grown up around them over the years. A narrow path wound its way up the hillside, clearly used often enough to remain visible but not maintained in any formal way. "This is it," Thomas announced, gesturing toward the ruins above. "The old watchtower. No one knows exactly when it was built. Some say it dates back to the time of the Romans. Others claim it's from the early kings of England. Either way, it's been abandoned for at least 200 years. The stones are still solid, though, and the climb is worth the effort." He started up the path, then paused and looked back at her. "The way can be steep in places. May I offer you my hand? Just to make sure you don't slip on any loose stones." It was such a simple gesture, so courteously offered, but Rosalind felt a thrill run through her at the prospect of physical contact with him. In the castle, men rarely touched her except in the most formal circumstances. A hand offered in dance, an arm to escort her into dinner. Even those touches were gloved and ritualized, empty of any real connection. But Thomas's offer was different, born of genuine concern and offered with respect for her autonomy. She could refuse if she wished, and he would accept that refusal without offense. "Thank you," she said, extending her hand to him. "I would appreciate that." His hand was warm and calloused when it closed around hers, the skin rough from years of working with tools and hot metal, but his grip was gentle and steady. They began climbing together, and Rosalind was grateful for his support as the path grew steeper and more uneven. Several times she stumbled on loose rocks, and each time his hand tightened on hers, keeping her upright and safe. The physical exertion of the climb was unfamiliar. Her life in the castle involved very little in the way of strenuous activity, and by the time they reached the top, she was breathing hard, and her legs ached in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. The view from the summit was everything Thomas had promised and more. The landscape spread out before them in a patchwork of fields and forests, roads and rivers, with the town of Ashford visible in the distance, its walls and buildings looking almost toy-like from this height. Even Thornhaven Castle, which seemed so imposing from within or below, appeared diminished from this perspective, just another structure on the landscape rather than the center of the world. "It's beautiful," Rosalind breathed, turning slowly to take in the full panorama. "I had no idea the countryside looked like this. I've never seen it from such a vantage point before." Thomas had not released her hand and she had not pulled away. They stood together in silence for a moment, the wind whipping around them and tugging at their clothes, and Rosalind felt something shift inside her, some fundamental reordering of priorities and understanding. From here, the divisions between noble and commoner seemed arbitrary and meaningless. The people working in those distant fields, the merchants traveling along those roads, the families living in those houses, they were all part of the same world, all equally real and valid and deserving of consideration. "It helps me remember what's important," Thomas said quietly. "When I feel frustrated or overwhelmed by the problems in town, by the injustices I see but cannot fix, I come here. From this distance, everything seems smaller, more manageable. It reminds me that my life is just one small part of a much larger story, but that doesn't make it meaningless. Every small thing we do, every kindness, every act of courage, every time we choose right over easy, it all matters, even if we can't see the full impact." Rosalind turned to look at him, at his profile as he gazed out over the landscape, and felt something inside her chest tighten and expand simultaneously. This man, this blacksmith who had no formal education, no noble breeding, no access to the libraries and tutors she had grown up with, possessed a wisdom and depth of understanding that surpassed most of the advisors in her father's court. He saw clearly what they were blind to, valued what they dismissed, and cared deeply about things they considered beneath their notice. "Thomas," she said, and something in her voice made him turn to face her fully. They were standing very close now, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes, could count the small scars on his hands that still held hers. "I need to tell you something, about who I am, about why I'm really here." Even as the words left her mouth, part of her was screaming that this was a mistake, that revelation would ruin everything, that some secrets were too dangerous to share. But another part, the part that was tired of deception and desperate for genuine connection, pushed her forward. Thomas's expression grew serious, and he squeezed her hand gently. "Mary, you don't have to tell me anything you're not comfortable sharing. I meant what I said yesterday. Everyone has a right to their privacy. But I want to tell you," Rosalind insisted, though her heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her own words. "I've been lying to you since we met, and you deserve better than that. You've been nothing but honest and kind, and I've repaid that with deception." She took a deep breath, preparing to reveal everything, her true identity, her reasons for the disguise, the impossible situation she found herself in. But before she could speak, the sound of horses approaching from below interrupted her. Both she and Thomas turned to look down the hillside, where a group of riders in the king's livery were visible on the road, heading toward the town at a rapid pace. "That's odd," Thomas murmured, releasing her hand to shade his eyes for a better view. "Those are the king's men, but they're riding like there's an emergency. I hope nothing's happened at the castle." Rosalind felt ice form in her stomach. Had her absence been discovered? Was her father even now searching for her, sending his men throughout the countryside to find his missing daughter? The timing could not be worse. Just as she was about to confess everything to Thomas, just as she was beginning to trust him enough to share the truth. "I should get back to town," she said, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. "My aunt will worry if I'm gone too long, and if there's some kind of emergency, I should be where she can find me." Thomas nodded, though his expression showed concern. "Of course. Let me help you back down the path. It's even more treacherous going downhill than climbing up." They descended the hillside as quickly as safety allowed, but with considerably more tension than they had climbed it. The moment of intimacy and impending revelation had passed, replaced by Rosalind's growing anxiety about what awaited her in town. By the time they reached the bottom of the hill and started back along the road toward Ashford, she was nearly running, and Thomas had to lengthen his stride to keep pace with her. "Mary, what's wrong?" he asked as they hurried along. "You seem frightened. Is it just the king's men, or is there something else?" "I can't explain," Rosalind said, which was at least partially true. "I just have a bad feeling about this. Please, can we move faster?" Thomas did not question her further, simply matched her pace and kept a protective hand at her elbow to steady her, when she stumbled in her haste. They made it back to Ashford's gates in record time, both of them breathing hard from the exertion. The town was buzzing with activity. People gathered in small groups talking in urgent whispers, and the tension in the air was palpable. Thomas stopped one of his neighbors, a middle-aged woman carrying a basket of vegetables. "Mistress Cooper, what's happened? Why are the king's men riding through town?" The woman's eyes were wide with the excitement of being first to share dramatic news. "Haven't you heard? The princess has gone missing, vanished from her chambers sometime this morning, and no one can find her anywhere in the castle. The king is beside himself with worry, sending men out to search the entire kingdom. There's talk of kidnapping, or worse." She leaned in closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Some say she ran away, couldn't bear the thought of the marriage her father was arranging. Can you imagine? A princess, running away like some common servant girl." Rosalind felt the blood drain from her face. This was so much worse than she had anticipated. She had thought perhaps her absence had been noted, that there might be some awkward questions to answer. But a full-scale search, accusations of kidnapping, her father in a panic. The situation had spiraled completely out of control. "I have to go," she said to Thomas, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, I have to go right now." She tried to pull away, but Thomas caught her arm gently but firmly. His eyes were studying her face with an intensity that suggested he was beginning to put pieces together, to see connections he had not seen before. "Mary, wait. This is about you somehow, isn't it? The way you're reacting to this news. It's not just concern for the princess. It's something more personal." "Please, Thomas," Rosalind begged, tears beginning to form in her eyes despite her best efforts to control them. "Please let me go. I'll explain everything, I promise, but right now I need to go before this gets any worse." For a moment Thomas held her gaze, and she could see the questions and confusion in his eyes. But then his expression softened, and he released her arm. "Go. Do what you need to do. But Mary, or whatever your real name is, please be safe. And please come back to me when you can. I don't understand what's happening, but I know I don't want to lose you." Rosalind nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, and then she was running through the streets toward the castle, dodging around people and carts, her hood falling back from her face in her haste. She no longer cared if anyone recognized her, no longer worried about maintaining her disguise. All that mattered was getting back to the castle before the situation escalated further, before her father did something drastic in his panic. She made it to the servants' entrance and through the hidden passages, her heart pounding and her lungs burning. Catherine was pacing in her chambers, wringing her hands, and when Rosalind burst through the door, the handmaiden nearly collapsed with relief. "Thank God," Catherine gasped. "Your Highness, what were you thinking, staying away so long? The king discovered your absence when he sent for you at lunch, and when I couldn't produce you, he insisted on checking your chambers himself. I had no choice but to tell him you had gone out for a walk in the gardens. He sent men to search the grounds, and of course they couldn't find you. He's convinced something terrible has happened, that you've been taken by enemies or revolutionaries." Rosalind allowed Catherine to help her out of the peasant clothes and into one of her regular gowns, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely manage the fastenings. Her mind raced with potential explanations, stories that might account for her absence without revealing the truth. But before she could settle on anything, heavy footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, followed by a thunderous pounding on her chamber door. "Rosalind!" Her father's voice boomed from the other side. "Open this door immediately!" Catherine shot her a panicked look, but there was nothing to be done. Rosalind crossed to the door and opened it, revealing King Richard flanked by 4 guards and looking more furious than she had ever seen him. His face was flushed, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and relief, and when he saw her standing there apparently unharmed, something in his expression cracked. "Where in God's name have you been?" he demanded, pushing past her into the room and gesturing for the guards to remain outside. "I have had every man at my disposal searching the castle and grounds for hours, fearing you had been kidnapped or worse, and you simply appear in your chambers as if nothing were amiss." "I'm sorry, Father," Rosalind said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "I went for a walk and lost track of time. I didn't mean to cause such alarm." "A walk?" King Richard repeated incredulously. "For hours? Without informing anyone of your intentions? Without taking a single guard for protection? Do you have any idea what thoughts ran through my mind? What scenarios I imagined? He moved closer to her, and his voice dropped to something more dangerous than his shout had been. "And you're lying to me. I can see it in your face, in the way you won't meet my eyes. Tell me the truth, Rosalind. Where were you really?" Rosalind felt trapped, caught between the necessity of maintaining her deception and the impossibility of sustaining it under her father's interrogation. She opened her mouth, closed it again, her mind desperately searching for some middle ground between truth and lies. It was Catherine who broke the impasse, stepping forward and dropping into a deep curtsy. "Your Majesty, if I may speak, the fault is mine." Her Highness confided in me that she was feeling overwhelmed by the pressures of the upcoming visit from Prince Alexander. She wished for some time alone to think, to prepare herself mentally for what lies ahead. I helped her slip out through the servants' passages so she could walk in the town undisturbed. I should have informed someone of her whereabouts, but she begged me to keep her confidence, and I foolishly agreed. The handmaiden's intervention was masterful, offering enough truth to be believable while omitting the most damaging details. King Richard turned his attention to Catherine, his expression still dark, but some of the raw fury beginning to fade. "You helped my daughter sneak out of the castle, into the town, alone and unprotected?" He looked back at Rosalind. "Is this true? Were you walking around Ashford dressed as what exactly?" There was no point in denying it now. Rosalind lifted her chin, meeting her father's gaze directly. "As a common woman, I wanted to see the kingdom as it truly is, Father, not through the filtered lens of carefully arranged tours and scripted encounters. I wanted to understand how our people live, what struggles they face. And in doing so, you put yourself in tremendous danger," King Richard said, though his tone had shifted from fury to something closer to exasperation. "Do you not understand that there are people who would harm you given the chance? Revolutionaries who speak of overthrowing the monarchy, criminals who would ransom you for gold, foreign agents who would use you as leverage against me. Your safety is not just a personal concern, Rosalind. You are the heir to the throne. Your life is not entirely your own to risk." "I know that," Rosalind replied quietly, "and I'm sorry for the worry I caused you. But Father, I learned so much in those few hours outside these walls. I saw how heavily your taxes weigh on common families, how they struggle to afford basic necessities while we feast on delicacies every night. I saw empty houses where families once lived before being forced out by debts they could not pay. I heard people speak of injustices that I never knew existed because no one here ever tells us the whole truth." King Richard's expression hardened again. "And you think a few hours of playing peasant makes you an expert on governance? The decisions I make are complex, balancing countless factors that you cannot possibly understand. War is expensive, Rosalind. Maintaining order and security requires resources. Yes, people struggle, but they would struggle far more if we were overrun by enemies or descended into chaos." "I'm not questioning your intentions," Rosalind said, choosing her words carefully. "I'm questioning whether the information you receive is accurate and complete. Your advisors tell you what they think you want to hear, or what serves their own interests. How can you make good decisions based on incomplete or biased information?" For a moment, father and daughter stared at each other, and Rosalind could see her father wrestling with the validity of her argument versus his anger at her deception and recklessness. Finally, he let out a long breath and moved to sit in one of the chairs near the window, suddenly looking every one of his years. "Perhaps there is some truth in what you say," he admitted reluctantly, "but that does not excuse your actions. You are forbidden from leaving the castle grounds without my explicit permission, and certainly not without proper escort, and you will dismiss Catherine from your service immediately for her role in this deception." "No," Rosalind protested. "Father, please. Catherine was only trying to help me. She argued against the plan, tried to dissuade me. If anyone should be punished, it should be me, not her." King Richard looked at Catherine, who stood with her head bowed, awaiting her fate. "You have served this family faithfully for many years. That loyalty is the only reason I am not having you thrown in the dungeons for endangering my daughter. But I cannot allow such insubordination to go unpunished. You are dismissed from the princess's personal service, effective immediately. You will be reassigned to work in the kitchens." Catherine curtsied deeply, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Your Majesty, for your mercy." "Catherine, no," Rosalind said, moving toward her handmaiden, but her father's sharp command stopped her. "Enough, Rosalind. The matter is decided." He stood and moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "You will remain in your chambers for the next 3 days. Your meals will be brought to you, and you will receive no visitors except for your tutors. Use this time to reflect on your responsibilities and the consequences of your reckless behavior. And when Prince Alexander arrives at the end of the week, you will greet him with appropriate courtesy and enthusiasm. Am I understood? Yes, father, Rosalind whispered, defeated. After the king left, taking Catherine with him and leaving a new, unfamiliar servant to attend to Rosalind's needs, the princess sank onto her bed and allowed herself to cry. She cried for Catherine, demoted because of her loyalty. She cried for herself, trapped once again in her gilded cage with its walls now reinforced. But most of all, she cried for Thomas, who had offered her friendship and possibly something more, who had shown her a different way of seeing the world, and whom she would now never see again. The 3 days of confinement passed with agonizing slowness. Rosalind's new handmaiden, a stern older woman named Beatrice, was efficient but cold, performing her duties with mechanical precision and showing no interest in conversation. The tutors who came to continue Rosalind's education must have been warned about her transgression, because they treated her with a formality that had not been present before, as if she were a stranger rather than a student they had known for years. Rosalind spent hours staring out her window at the town below, wondering what Thomas was doing, whether he had figured out the truth about her identity, what he thought of her now. She replayed their conversations in her mind, remembering the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the strength in his hand when he helped her up the hillside, the passion in his voice when he spoke about justice and community. Had it all been real, or had she simply imagined a connection that did not exist? On the evening of the 3rd day, Beatrice entered with a message. Your Highness, your confinement is ended. The king requests your presence in the Great Hall tomorrow morning to greet Prince Alexander, who arrived this afternoon while you were indisposed. Rosalind felt her stomach drop. The moment she had been dreading had arrived. Tomorrow she would meet yet another suitor chosen for political convenience, would have to smile and make pleasant conversation, would be expected to see him as a potential husband, while her heart remained with a blacksmith she could never have. That night she barely slept, and when morning came, Beatrice dressed her in one of her finest gowns, deep blue silk with silver embroidery that caught the light with every movement. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style with pearls woven throughout, and a sapphire necklace that had belonged to her mother adorned her throat. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a princess prepared for display, beautiful and untouchable and utterly miserable. The great hall had been prepared for the formal reception, with fresh rushes on the floor and the finest tapestries hanging on the walls. Nobles and courtiers lined the sides of the room, all dressed in their best clothing, eager to witness this first meeting between the princess and her potential future husband. King Richard sat on his throne at the far end of the hall, looking pleased with himself in a way that made Rosalind's jaw clench with resentment. She took her place standing beside her father's throne, her hands folded demurely in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. The great doors opened, and Prince Alexander entered, accompanied by his own retinue of guards and advisors. Rosalind's first impression was that he was handsome. She could not deny that. He appeared to be in his late 20s, tall and well-built, with dark hair and aristocratic features. He moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to command, his clothing rich without being ostentatious, his bearing that of a man who had been raised from birth to rule. By all objective measures, he should have been everything she could hope for in a husband. But as he approached and bowed formally to her father before turning his attention to her, Rosalind felt nothing. No spark of attraction, no flutter of excitement, no sense of possibility. His eyes, when they met hers, were intelligent but calculating, assessing her as one might assess a horse before purchase. His smile was polite but did not reach those eyes, and when he spoke his voice was cultured and pleasant, but completely lacking in warmth. "Princess Rosalind," he said, bowing over her hand, "it is a great honor to finally make your acquaintance. Your beauty has been described to me in great detail, but I find that the descriptions fell far short of reality." The compliment was smooth and practiced, exactly what convention demanded, but it meant nothing. Rosalind forced herself to smile and murmur an appropriate response, going through the motions of courtesy while her mind screamed in rebellion. This was her future, she realized with a sick certainty. This handsome, well-bred prince who looked at her and saw a political asset, a means to an end, a princess-shaped piece to move around his strategic board. The formal reception continued with speeches and toasts, with Prince Alexander sharing carefully rehearsed stories about his kingdom and his achievements, with her father beaming at what he clearly saw as a perfect match. Through it all, Rosalind played her part, the dutiful princess, saying the right things and smiling at the right moments, while inside she felt something vital, withering and dying. Over the following days, Prince Alexander courted Rosalind with all the formality and precision expected of a nobleman seeking a politically advantageous marriage. They took walks through the castle gardens under the watchful eyes of chaperones, sat together at elaborate dinners where conversation remained safely superficial, and attended musical performances in the great hall where they could barely speak over the sound of instruments. Every interaction was choreographed, every moment observed, every word measured for propriety and political implication. Prince Alexander was, Rosalind had to admit, perfectly acceptable by every conventional standard. He was educated and well-spoken, knowledgeable about history and philosophy, skilled in the arts of war and diplomacy. He treated her with courtesy and respect, never overstepping boundaries or making inappropriate advances. He spoke intelligently about the alliance between their kingdoms, the benefits that would accrue to both sides, the stability and prosperity such a union could bring. He was everything a princess should want in a husband. And yet, Rosalind found herself comparing every word he spoke to conversations with Thomas, every calculated gesture to the blacksmith's genuine warmth, every proper smile to the way Thomas's entire face had transformed with joy when he saw her. Where Prince Alexander's compliments felt rehearsed, Thomas's simple statements had carried the weight of sincerity. Where the prince discussed grand political strategies, Thomas had spoken of individual people and their struggles. Where Alexander saw her as Princess Rosalind, useful and ornamental, Thomas had seen Mary, just a woman worth talking to, worth listening to, worth defending. On the 5th day of Prince Alexander's visit, as they walked through the gardens with Lady Ashworth trailing at a discreet distance, the prince broached the subject that had been lurking beneath all their interactions. "Princess Rosalind, I believe we have spent sufficient time in each other's company to form initial impressions," he said, his tone as formal as if he were discussing a trade agreement. "I find you to be everything I could desire in a wife and future queen. Your beauty, your education, your bearing, all are exemplary. I have spoken with your father, and he has given his blessing, should I choose to make a formal proposal. I would like to know your thoughts on the matter before proceeding." Rosalind felt her throat tighten. This was the moment she had been dreading, the culmination of all her father's planning and her own rebellion. She could give the expected answer, accept this suitable match, do her duty as a princess and secure the alliance her father desired, or she could speak the truth that burned in her heart. Consequences be damned. "Prince Alexander," she said carefully, choosing each word with deliberate precision, "you are, without question, an excellent match by every measure that matters to kings and advisers. An alliance between our kingdoms would be strategically sound and mutually beneficial. You are accomplished, intelligent, and honorable. Any princess would be fortunate to receive such an offer." "I sense a but approaching," Alexander said, and for the first time since his arrival, something like genuine emotion flickered across his face. Not anger, but perhaps a hint of resigned understanding. "But I do not love you," Rosalind said simply, "and I do not believe you love me. We barely know each other beyond the carefully curated versions of ourselves we have presented over these past days. You look at me and see a princess who will bring you political advantage and an heir to secure your dynasty. I look at you and see a stranger who happens to hold the right title and command the right resources." Prince Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful rather than offended. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its formal edge. "You are more honest than most noble women I have met, Princess. Many would accept such an arrangement without question, or at least without voicing their reservations. May I ask what alternative you envision? In our positions, marriages for love are rare luxuries. Duty must take precedence over personal desire." "I understand that is the common wisdom," Rosalind replied, feeling a reckless courage building within her. "But I cannot help but question whether it must always be so. What if we demanded more from our lives than mere political convenience? What if we insisted that personal happiness and fulfillment were not luxuries but necessities, even for those of us born to titles and responsibilities?" Then we would be asking to remake the entire structure of noble society, Alexander said, though his tone was more contemplative than dismissive. And while that might be an admirable goal in the abstract, it is not something that can be accomplished by two individuals acting in isolation. Your father expects this alliance. My father expects it. Our kingdoms have already begun making plans based on the assumption of our union. To refuse now would have consequences for many people beyond just ourselves. I know, Rosalind admitted, feeling the weight of those consequences pressing down on her shoulders. And perhaps I am being selfish and foolish. But I have recently learned what it feels like to be seen as a person rather than a political asset, to have conversations that matter rather than exchanges of carefully scripted pleasantries. And having tasted that kind of genuine connection, I find I cannot willingly surrender it for a marriage that offers everything except what I most desire. Prince Alexander stopped walking and turned to face her fully, studying her with an intensity that suggested he was reassessing his understanding of who she was. There is someone else, isn't there? Someone you care for deeply. Someone who represents this genuine connection you speak of. Rosalind saw no point in denying it. Yes. Though the situation is impossible, the feelings are real. And they have shown me what marriage could be if both parties truly cared for each other, truly saw and valued each other as individuals rather than as political chess pieces. Does your father know about this other person? Alexander asked. Not the full truth, no. He knows I went into the town in disguise, but not whom I met there or what passed between us. Rosalind paused, then added, and before you ask, nothing improper occurred. We simply talked, spent time together, but those conversations meant more to me than all the formal courtship rituals we have engaged in these past days. To her surprise, Prince Alexander smiled, not his usual polite social smile, but something warmer and more genuine. Princess Rosalind, I find I must respect your honesty, even though it complicates my plans considerably. And if I am being equally honest, I must confess that I too have someone in my own kingdom. A lady of lower nobility, whom I have known since childhood and have loved for many years. But duty demanded I put aside personal feelings and seek a marriage that would benefit my kingdom. Rosalind stared at him in astonishment. You love someone else? Then why go through with this charade? Why pursue a marriage you do not want? Because, as I said, duty must take precedence, Alexander replied, though his voice held a note of bitterness. My father, the king, has made it clear that my personal preferences are irrelevant to matters of state. An alliance with your kingdom brings significant strategic advantages that cannot be ignored or sacrificed for mere sentiment. I had resigned myself to doing what was necessary, to marrying appropriately and perhaps maintaining my actual love as a discreet companion on the side, as so many nobles do. That sounds like a recipe for misery for everyone involved, Rosalind said bluntly. It does, doesn't it? Alexander agreed with a rueful laugh. And yet, it is the accepted pattern, the way things have always been done. We are expected to sacrifice our hearts on the altar of political necessity and pretend that this is noble rather than tragic. They resumed walking, and for the first time since his arrival, Rosalind felt a genuine connection with Prince Alexander, not romantic attraction, but a sense of kinship born of shared understanding and mutual frustration with the constraints of their positions. What if we simply refused? Rosalind suggested, though even as she spoke the words, she knew how naive they sounded. What if we both told our fathers that we will not marry for political convenience, that we demand the right to choose our own paths? Your father would likely confine you to the castle permanently and find another suitable match, Alexander said pragmatically. My father would disinherit me and name my younger brother as heir, which would actually suit my brother quite well, as he has always coveted the throne. We would lose everything, our positions, our influence, our ability to make any positive change in the world. And for what? The slim chance that we might find happiness with the people we actually love? Yes, Rosalind said firmly. Exactly that. Because what good is power and influence if it comes at the cost of our humanity? What value is there in ruling if we ourselves are enslaved to duty and expectation? Prince Alexander looked at her with something approaching admiration. You truly mean that? You would give up your crown, your birthright, everything you have known, for the chance to be with this person you met in the town? Rosalind considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would reveal the depth of her feelings, not just to Alexander but to herself. I don't know if what I feel for Thomas is love, We barely know each other, and most of what he knows about me is based on deception. But what I do know is that the few hours I spent with him showed me what life could be like if I were free to be myself, to make genuine connections, to live according to my own values rather than inherited expectations. And yes, I would give up my crown for that freedom, that authenticity. What good is being a princess if I must sacrifice every part of myself that makes me who I am? Thomas, Alexander repeated thoughtfully. So he has a name. And what is his station? Another noble, perhaps minor nobility trying to rise through connection to the royal family? He's a blacksmith, Rosalind said, lifting her chin defiantly as if daring Alexander to mock her. A common tradesman with no title, no wealth beyond what his labor earns him, no connection to the court or political power whatsoever. By every measure that matters to people like my father, he is completely unsuitable. And by every measure that matters to me, he is extraordinary. Prince Alexander was quiet for a long moment, and Rosalind prepared herself for the dismissive response she expected. Lectures about the impossibility of such a match, reminders of her duty, perhaps even threats to reveal her secret to her father. But when he finally spoke, his words surprised her yet again. I think, he said slowly, that we may have an opportunity here, one that could benefit us both, if we are brave enough to seize it and clever enough to manage it properly. What do you mean? Rosalind asked, curiosity overriding her wariness. Your father wants this alliance because he believes it will strengthen his position, provide resources for his ongoing conflicts, and secure favorable trade agreements. My father wants it for similar reasons from his side. But what if we could give them those same benefits without actually marrying each other? What if we could negotiate a treaty between our kingdoms that provides everything they want diplomatically and economically, but leaves us free to make our own choices about marriage? Rosalind felt a flicker of hope, though she tried not to let it overwhelm her skepticism. Do you really think that's possible? That our fathers would accept such an arrangement? I think, Alexander said carefully, that kings are ultimately practical men who care more about results than methods. If we can present them with a treaty that gives them everything they want, military cooperation, favorable trade terms, mutual defense agreements, perhaps even a betrothal between your future children and mine, should we each marry other people, they might be persuaded to accept it. They want alliance and stability, not specifically a marriage between us. That has simply been the traditional method of securing such things. The idea was audacious, perhaps even reckless. But it offered something Rosalind had not dared to hope for, a possible path forward that did not require her to sacrifice either her duty or her happiness. Over the next 2 days, she and Prince Alexander worked in secret to draft a treaty proposal that would satisfy both kingdoms' strategic needs while leaving them personally free. They met in the castle library under the pretense of Alexander researching the histories of both their kingdoms, and there, surrounded by ancient texts and maps, they crafted a document that represented a new kind of alliance. The proposed treaty included military cooperation agreements that would allow both kingdoms to call upon each other's forces in times of need, trade arrangements that eliminated tariffs on key goods and established favorable exchange rates, and a mutual defense pact that would make attacking either kingdom tantamount to declaring war on both. To sweeten the arrangement and provide the dynastic connection their fathers valued, they included a provision for a future betrothal between Alexander's firstborn child and Rosalind's, should both have children of appropriate ages and opposite genders, with the understanding that this betrothal would only proceed if both children consented when they came of age. It's not perfect, Alexander admitted as they reviewed their work. There will be resistance from traditionalists who believe that marriage between royals is the only reliable way to secure lasting alliance. But the terms we've outlined are actually more comprehensive and binding than a simple marriage agreement would be. We're proposing a true partnership between kingdoms, not just a union between individuals. The question is whether we can convince our fathers of that, Rosalind said, feeling anxiety knot in her stomach at the prospect of presenting this to King Richard. My father is not particularly open to unconventional ideas. He sees the world in terms of precedent and tradition. Suggesting that we deviate from centuries of established practice will not be easy. Then we must frame it not as deviation, but as innovation, Alexander suggested. We present this as a more enlightened approach, one that acknowledges the changing nature of international relations, while still honoring the core purposes of royal alliance. And we must be prepared to defend it vigorously, to answer every objection and address every concern. They requested an audience with both King Richard and King Philip, Alexander's father, who had accompanied him on the journey. The two kings agreed to meet them in the council chamber, clearly expecting to discuss wedding arrangements and perhaps negotiate the specific terms of the marriage contract. Both men looked surprised when Alexander and Rosalind entered carrying a thick document and wearing expressions of determination, rather than the bashful excitement expected of a newly betrothed couple. "Father, your majesty," Alexander began, addressing both kings with formal courtesy, "Princess Rosalind and I have spent these past days in deep discussion about the proposed alliance between our kingdoms. We are both committed to securing the strongest possible partnership between Ashford and our realm, one that will benefit both our peoples for generations to come. To that end, we have prepared a comprehensive treaty proposal that we believe accomplishes all the strategic goals of a traditional marriage alliance while providing even greater security and clarity of terms." King Richard's expression darkened immediately. "What are you talking about? The alliance is secured through your marriage to my daughter. That has been understood from the beginning." "With respect, your majesty," Rosalind said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her, "marriage has traditionally been used as a mechanism for alliance, but it is not the only mechanism available to us. What my father and King Philip truly want is military cooperation, favorable trade relations, and mutual defense. The treaty we have drafted provides all of those things with far greater specificity and enforceability than a marriage contract would offer." King Philip, a stern-looking man with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes, took the document from Alexander and began reading through it, his expression unreadable. King Richard, however, was not so measured in his response. "This is absurd," he declared, rising from his seat. "You think you can substitute a piece of paper for the sacred bond of marriage? Alliances built on treaties alone are fragile things, easily broken when circumstances change. Marriage creates blood ties, family connections that transcend political convenience." "But, father," Rosalind countered, forcing herself to meet his angry gaze, "how many marriages between royals have failed to prevent war when strategic interests diverged? How many family connections have proven worthless when kingdoms found themselves on opposite sides of conflicts? The bond of marriage is only as strong as the individuals involved choose to make it, and forcing two people who barely know each other to wed for political purposes does not guarantee loyalty or cooperation." "She makes a valid point," King Philip interjected, still reading through the treaty. "And I must say, this document is remarkably thorough. The trade provisions alone would benefit both our kingdoms substantially, and the Mutual Defense Pact is actually stronger than what a marriage alliance would typically provide. They've included specific trigger clauses, detailed military obligations, and enforcement mechanisms that go far beyond the vague promises that usually accompany royal weddings." King Richard snatched the document from his fellow monarch and began reading it himself, his frown deepening with each page. "This is all very clever," he admitted grudgingly, "but it does not address the fundamental issue. Rosalind, you are my only child, my heir. Your marriage is not just about alliance. It is about succession, about ensuring the continuation of our royal line. You must marry someone of appropriate rank and produce heirs who can rule after you. This treaty does nothing to secure that. The treaty includes a provision for future betrothal between our children," Alexander pointed out. "And it leaves both Princess Rosalind and myself free to marry other suitable partners and produce those necessary heirs. The dynastic connection between our kingdoms can still be forged, simply one generation removed. And in the meantime, you expect me to allow my daughter to remain unmarried indefinitely while you pursue this theoretical arrangement?" King Richard demanded. "She is already 22, well past the age when most noble women wed. How long do you propose she wait?" Rosalind took a deep breath, knowing that this was the crucial moment, the point at which she must speak the truth she had been holding back. "Father, I do not propose to remain unmarried indefinitely. I have met someone I care for deeply, someone I wish to marry if you will give your blessing." The council chamber fell absolutely silent. King Philip's eyebrows rose in surprise, and King Richard's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, understanding, and then fury as he connected the pieces. "The blacksmith," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. The man you met during your unauthorized excursion into the town. This is what this is really about, isn't it? You would reject an alliance with one of the most powerful kingdoms on the continent for a common tradesman? Thomas is not common in any way that matters, Rosalind said, her voice gaining strength as she defended the man she loved. He is intelligent, principled, compassionate, and brave. He cares about the welfare of others, speaks truth even when it is uncomfortable, and lives according to values that most nobles only pretend to honor. He would make a far better consort than most of the self-serving aristocrats who populate this court. A blacksmith as prince consort? King Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it. Can you imagine the scandal? The mockery we would face from every noble house in the kingdom. I would be seen as weak, allowing my daughter to make such an unsuitable match. Our authority, our very legitimacy, would be questioned. Or, King Philip said thoughtfully, drawing everyone's attention, you could be seen as enlightened, progressive, a king who values merit and character over mere accident of birth. There is precedent for such matches, though admittedly rare, and if this blacksmith is truly as exceptional as your daughter claims, perhaps he could serve as a bridge between the monarchy and the common people, a symbol of your commitment to all your subjects rather than just the nobility. King Richard stared at his fellow monarch as if he had lost his mind. You cannot be serious. You would actually support such an absurd arrangement. I would support an arrangement that gives me everything I want strategically, while allowing my son to marry the woman he actually loves. King Philip replied pragmatically. Alexander has been honest with me about his feelings for Lady Catherine, a young noblewoman in our court. I have been pressuring him to set aside those feelings for duty, but if there is a way to secure alliance without requiring him to sacrifice his happiness, then I am willing to consider it. King Richard looked between them all, his daughter standing defiant, Prince Alexander calm and collected, King Philip surprisingly supportive, and Rosalind could see him struggling with competing imperatives. His desire for traditional order and hierarchy warred with the practical benefits of the proposed treaty, and the realization that forcing the issue might drive an irreparable wedge between himself and his only child. This is madness, he muttered, but his tone had shifted from absolute refusal to reluctant consideration. Even if I were willing to entertain this ridiculous notion, how would such an arrangement work practically? A blacksmith does not have the education or training to serve as consort. He knows nothing of court life, of diplomacy, of the responsibilities that would fall to him. Then he can be taught, Rosalind said quickly, sensing an opening. Just as any foreign prince marrying into our family would need to learn our customs and ways. Thomas is intelligent and capable of learning, and his outsider perspective might actually be valuable, providing insights that those raised entirely within the court system cannot see. I would want to meet this man before making any decision, King Richard said, and he would need to understand exactly what he would be taking on, the scrutiny he would face, the challenges of such an unprecedented match. If he lacks the courage or capability to handle that pressure, then this entire discussion is moot. Then allow me to bring him here, Rosalind urged. Let him speak for himself, demonstrate his character and abilities. I believe you will find him more impressive than you expect. King Richard rubbed his temples as if fighting off a headache, then waved his hand in a gesture of exhausted capitulation. Very well, bring your blacksmith to court. But understand this, Rosalind, if he proves unsuitable in any way, if he embarrasses this family or shows himself unequal to the position, then you will accept Prince Alexander's proposal, and this conversation will never be revisited. Do I make myself clear? Perfectly clear, Father. Rosalind agreed, her heart soaring with hope despite the conditions attached to it. The rest of the meeting was devoted to reviewing the treaty in detail, with both kings asking questions and proposing modifications. By the end, they had agreed to a preliminary version that would be sent to their respective councils for further refinement, with the understanding that final ratification would depend on the resolution of the blacksmith situation, as King Richard insistently referred to it. As soon as she was dismissed from the council chamber, Rosalind hurried to find Catherine. Her former handmaiden was indeed working in the kitchens now, her fine clothing replaced by a simple servant's dress, her hands red from washing dishes in hot water. When Catherine saw the princess approaching, she quickly wiped her hands and dropped into a curtsy, clearly uncertain of how she should behave given her changed circumstances. Catherine, I need your help, Rosalind said urgently. I need you to get a message to Thomas, the blacksmith in the market square. Tell him that Princess Rosalind requests his presence at the castle tomorrow at midday, that it is a matter of utmost importance. Can you do that?" Catherine's eyes widened. "Your Highness, I'm not sure I should be seen running errands for you. Your father specifically—" "Please, Catherine," Rosalind begged. "I know what I'm asking, and I know the position it puts you in. But this is important beyond measure. Everything depends on Thomas coming here, on him having the chance to prove himself." "I will find a way to have you reinstated in my service, I promise. But right now, I desperately need you to do this one thing for me." Catherine studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Your Highness. I'll take my half-day leave tomorrow morning and deliver your message. But after this, you must promise me you'll be more careful. I cannot continue to facilitate these schemes without risking everything I have left." "I promise," Rosalind said, embracing her former handmaiden impulsively. "And Catherine, thank you for everything, for your loyalty, your friendship, your willingness to help me even when it costs you dearly. I will not forget it." The next morning seemed to last an eternity. Rosalind dressed with particular care, choosing a gown that was elegant but not ostentatious, wanting to look like herself rather than hiding behind excessive finery. She paced her chambers, rehearsing what she would say to Thomas, how she would explain her deception and her feelings, how she would prepare him for the scrutiny he would face. Catherine returned just before midday with news that she had delivered the message and that Thomas had agreed to come, though he had been understandably confused and apprehensive about the summons. Rosalind positioned herself in a small receiving room near the main entrance, wanting to greet Thomas personally before he was subjected to the formal court environment. When he arrived, escorted by a bemused guard who clearly thought there had been some mistake in allowing a common blacksmith into the castle, Rosalind felt her breath catch at the sight of him. He had cleaned up and dressed in what were clearly his best clothes, a simple but well-made tunic and breeches, his hair combed back, his face freshly shaved. But despite his efforts to appear presentable, he looked profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes wide as he took in the grandeur of his surroundings. "Mary?" he said when he saw her, then stopped, confusion warring with dawning comprehension on his face as he took in her fine gown, the rich surroundings, the deference with which the servants treated her. "Or perhaps that isn't your real name after all?" "No," Rosalind admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "My real name is Rosalind, Princess Rosalind, and I owe you an enormous apology and an explanation. Thomas, I lied to you about who I was, and I'm sorrier for that than I can possibly express. But everything else, all our conversations, the feelings I developed, the respect and admiration I felt for you, all of that was real. The most real thing in my life, actually." Thomas stood frozen, processing this information, and Rosalind could see the hurt and betrayal flickering across his features. "A princess," he said slowly. "You were a princess the entire time, and you let me talk about the king and the court and injustice, never telling me that you were part of the very system I was criticizing. Did you find it amusing? Was I some kind of entertaining diversion for you?" "No!" Rosalind moved toward him, then stopped when he took a step back. "Thomas, please, it wasn't like that at all. I disguised myself because I wanted to understand my kingdom as it truly is, not through the filtered lens of courtly reports. Meeting you, talking with you, seeing the world through your eyes, it changed everything for me. It made me see the flaws in how we govern, the disconnect between the nobility and the people we're supposed to serve. It made me want to be better, to do better." "And what exactly am I doing here?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Why summon me to the castle? To apologize in person for your deception?" "To make sure I understand that whatever I thought was developing between us can never be anything more than a princess's brief adventure among the common folk. Actually," Rosalind said, taking a deep breath, "I summoned you here because I want to marry you. If you'll have me despite my deception, despite the complications, despite everything that would make such a match difficult and unprecedented. I want you, Thomas. Not because you're convenient or politically advantageous, but because you're kind and honest and principled, and because being with you makes me feel more like myself than I have ever felt in this castle." Thomas stared at her, his mouth opening and closing without sound as he tried to process this declaration. Finally, he managed, "You want to marry me, a blacksmith, Princess Rosalind wants to marry a common blacksmith. Yes, Rosalind said simply. But before you answer, you need to understand what you would be agreeing to. If you accept, you would become prince consort, which means endless scrutiny, constant criticism from those who think you're unsuitable, pressure to learn courtly ways and navigate political intrigue. Your life would change completely, in ways that might make you desperately wish you had never met me. And there's a very real possibility that my father will decide you're not suitable after all and forbid the match, which would break both our hearts. So I'm asking you to take an enormous risk, to trust me despite my deception, and to believe that what we could build together is worth all the hardship we would face. Thomas moved closer to her, his eyes searching her face as if trying to see past any remaining deceptions to the truth beneath. When he spoke, his voice was soft but steady. Mary, Rosalind, when we talked in the market, when you visited my forge, when we climbed to that watchtower together, I felt something I had never felt before. A connection that seemed impossible, too perfect to be real. And maybe in some ways it wasn't real, built as it was on false pretenses. But what I know for certain is that I have thought of you every day since then, wondering if I would ever see you again, hoping against hope that somehow, despite all logic and reason, we might find a way to be together. So yes, I'll take that risk. I'll face that scrutiny and criticism. I'll learn whatever I need to learn and become whatever I need to become. Because the alternative, spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I had been brave enough to try, that's worse than any hardship I might face as your husband. Rosalind felt tears streaming down her face as she closed the distance between them and took his hands in hers, no longer caring about propriety or who might see. Then we'll face it together. All of it. The challenges, the opposition, the gossip, the complications. Together, Thomas. As partners, as equals, as two people who see each other clearly and choose each other anyway. Together. Thomas agreed, and then he was pulling her into his arms, holding her as if she were precious and fragile and strong all at once, and Rosalind knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. The formal introduction of Thomas to King Richard and the court was scheduled for that evening, giving him a few hours to be briefed by Rosalind and Prince Alexander about court customs and expectations. Thomas proved to be a quick study, his natural intelligence allowing him to grasp complex social dynamics rapidly, though he insisted on maintaining his own essential character rather than trying to pretend to be something he was not. I will show them respect, he told Rosalind as they prepared, but I will not grovel or pretend to be less than I am. If your father and his court cannot accept me as I truly am, then perhaps this match is not meant to be after all. When the time came, Thomas entered the great hall with his head held high, his bearing that of a man confident in his own worth regardless of others' opinions. King Richard sat on his throne, surrounded by advisors and nobles who had been summoned to witness this unprecedented meeting. The whispers and stares were immediate and unrelenting, but Thomas seemed to ignore them, focusing his attention on the king with steady respect. Your Majesty, Thomas said, bowing exactly as Rosalind had instructed him, I am Thomas, blacksmith of Ashford. I am honored by your summons, and grateful for the opportunity to address you and your court. King Richard studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Thomas the blacksmith, my daughter claims you possess exceptional qualities of character and intelligence that would make you suitable as prince consort despite your common birth. I find myself skeptical of such claims, but I have agreed to give you a fair hearing. Tell me, what makes you think you could handle the responsibilities and pressures of such a position? Thomas took a moment to consider his answer, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same honesty and directness that had first attracted Rosalind to him. Your Majesty, I would be lying if I claimed to be fully prepared for such responsibilities. I know nothing of court life beyond what I have observed from outside these walls, and I'm certain I would make mistakes as I learned. But what I can offer is a perspective that seems to be lacking in these halls, an understanding of how your policies affect ordinary people, a willingness to speak uncomfortable truths rather than pleasant lies, and a genuine commitment to serving the kingdom's welfare rather than my own advancement. I'm not asking to replace the nobles and advisors who have served you for years. I'm asking for the chance to complement their expertise with insights from a different vantage point. The answer seemed to catch King Richard off guard, and murmurs rippled through the assembled nobles. Some sounded scandalized by Thomas's boldness, but others seemed thoughtful, even intrigued. "You speak of uncomfortable truths," the king said. "Very well. Tell me an uncomfortable truth about my governance. Speak freely. You have my word that I will not punish honesty, however critical it may be." Thomas glanced at Rosalind, who gave him an encouraging nod, then returned his attention to the king. "Your Majesty, your tax policies are crushing the people of Ashford. Families that have lived here for generations are being forced to leave because they can no longer afford to stay. Children go hungry while the castle hosts elaborate feasts. Men are conscripted for wars they don't understand, leaving their families without support. And your advisors tell you that all is well because they either don't know the truth or don't want to risk your displeasure by reporting it. You are a king who cares about his people. I have heard you speak of your commitment to their welfare, but you are governing based on incomplete and inaccurate information. That is the uncomfortable truth, Your Majesty. Not that you are cruel or uncaring, but that you are isolated from the reality of your subjects' lives in ways that prevent you from governing as wisely as you otherwise might." The silence that followed was absolute. Several of the advisors looked furious at this criticism of their counsel, and many nobles appeared shocked by Thomas's audacity. But King Richard himself simply nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "And if you were to become Prince Consort," the king asked, "how would you propose to address this problem of isolation and incomplete information?" "I would spend time in the town regularly," Thomas replied without hesitation. "Not in formal visits where everyone has warning and time to prepare, but in genuine engagement with ordinary people going about their daily lives. I would listen to their concerns, observe their struggles, and bring those observations back to inform policy decisions. I would also work to create channels of communication between the common folk and the crown that don't rely solely on noble intermediaries who have their own interests to protect. And I would encourage Princess Rosalind to do the same, because she has shown herself remarkably capable of understanding and empathizing with people from all walks of life when given the opportunity." King Richard leaned back in his throne, his fingers steepled under his chin. "You are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, Blacksmith. Perhaps both, but I cannot deny that your words have merit, uncomfortable as they are to hear." He looked at Rosalind, and his expression softened slightly. "My daughter believes you have the character and intelligence to rise to the challenges of this position. Prince Alexander and King Philip have both spoken in your favor, though I suspect their motives are not entirely altruistic. And I must admit that your honesty and directness are refreshing compared to the calculated speech of courtiers. Very well. I will agree to this match on 3 conditions." Rosalind felt her heart leap with hope, even as she braced herself for what those conditions might be. "First," King Richard continued, "you will undergo intensive education in matters of state, law, history, and diplomacy. I will assign my best tutors to work with you, and you will prove yourself capable of learning what you need to know to serve effectively as consort. Second, you will demonstrate your commitment to the welfare of this kingdom by working with my advisors to develop and implement reforms that address the problems you have identified. You will not simply criticize, you will help fix what is broken. And third, you will marry my daughter in a ceremony befitting her station, and you will conduct yourself with the dignity and responsibility that position demands, regardless of any challenges or criticisms you face." "I accept all 3 conditions, Your Majesty," Thomas said without hesitation. "And I give you my word that I will spend every day of my life trying to be worthy of the trust you are placing in me and the love your daughter has shown me." King Richard nodded, then looked around the hall at his assembled court. "Let it be known that I have consented to the marriage of my daughter, Princess Rosalind, to Thomas, Blacksmith of Ashford, who shall be elevated to the rank of Prince Consort upon their union. Those who have doubts about this arrangement may come speak with me privately, but in public, I expect full support and respect for this decision. The wedding will take place 3 months hence, giving our groom time to complete his preliminary education and allowing proper preparations to be made." The hall erupted in conversation, some approving, many skeptical, but the decision had been made. Rosalind caught Thomas's eye across the room and saw in his expression a mixture of relief, anxiety, and determination that surely mirrored her own. They had won the first battle, but the war to prove the worth of their unconventional union was just beginning. The months that followed were intense and transformative for both of them. Thomas threw himself into his studies with the same dedication he had brought to mastering his craft, working late into the night to absorb information about law, history, economics, and diplomacy. Rosalind worked alongside him, and together they began developing proposals for tax reform, improved communication between the Crown and commoners, and programs to assist struggling families. Prince Alexander and King Philip signed the treaty and returned home, taking with them the promise of a strengthened alliance and Alexander's newfound freedom to marry his Lady Catherine. Catherine herself was reinstated to Rosalind's service, her loyalty and discretion having proven invaluable throughout the entire affair. On the day of the wedding, as Rosalind walked through the great hall toward where Thomas waited for her at the altar, she looked out at the assembled crowd and saw not just nobles but common folk who had been invited to witness this historic union. She saw Peter, Thomas's apprentice, beaming with pride. She saw the baker who sold honest bread, and the widow who shared her garden's harvest. She saw her father, still uncertain but willing to trust, and Catherine, crying happy tears. And she saw Thomas, no longer in the simple clothing of a blacksmith but in the fine garments of a prince, looking at her with such love and wonder that everything else faded away. When they joined hands and spoke their vows, Rosalind knew that she had chosen correctly. Not the easy path, not the traditional path, but the true path, the one that led to real partnership, genuine understanding, and a love built on mutual respect and shared values. As they left the cathedral as husband and wife, stepping out into sunlight and the cheers of a crowd that represented every level of society, Rosalind squeezed Thomas's hand and whispered, "Together." "Together," he agreed, and they walked forward into their new life, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them, confident that the foundation they had built, of honesty, respect, and genuine connection, would be strong enough to weather any storm. In the years that followed, Princess Rosalind and Prince Consort Thomas would prove to be transformative leaders for Ashford. Thomas's reforms improved the lives of common folk significantly, while Rosalind's diplomatic skills strengthened international alliances. Their marriage, once considered scandalous, became a symbol of hope and possibility, proof that love and duty need not be opposing forces, that wisdom could be found in unexpected places, and that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in following tradition, but in having the strength to forge a new path. And when their first child was born, a daughter with her mother's copper hair and her father's blue eyes, they named her Catherine, in honor of the loyal handmaiden whose help had made their entire story possible. It was, everyone agreed, a fitting tribute and a happy ending to an extraordinary tale.